So when people ask me what brand of Christian I am, I never know how to answer them. The most honest answer, that I am a charismatic, evangelical Anglo-Catholic, doesn't seem to clarify things much for people. And I have a similar problem when it comes to my theology. I'm often branded a process or open theist, and I tend to think, well, yes, except those times when I'm a classical Thomist, or, well, except for the very odd issue where I'm Reformed, which I try and tell John Knox whenever I pass his statue on my way into work. And maybe even I say, well, yes, I'm process or open from sort of Monday to Thursday most weeks. So this paper is an attempt to turn my general condition of theological rootlessness or multiple denominational identities into a constructive model rather than just being a confused mess. Now, two of those formational identities for me have been the Pentecostal movement and the influence of open and relational theologies. It was during my time at a Pentecostal Bible college that I first came across the works of people like Clark Pinnock and John Saunders, Rice and Hasker, and began to explore the theological possibilities of a temporal existence for God and all that that entailed. So that's sort of the common agreement between open and process is that God doesn't know the future. It's open to creatures participating and co-creating the future with God. So during my PhD, I spent a good deal of time on the question of divine action and was deeply influenced by a number of process thinkers. Then last year, in sort of a full circle move, I began to read about Pentecostal ontologies of divine action, primarily in the works of Amos Young and James K.A. Smith. And in Smith's article, Is the Universe Open to Surprise?, he articulates one of the main issues with a Pentecostal theory of divine action. He writes, a Pentecostal contribution to the dialogue of divine action would inevitably be gauche precisely because it would transgress an unspoken taboo in the parlor of the conversation, that one not question the science side of the conversation, and in particular not ruin the party by calling into question the governing naturalistic assumptions of science. Smith worries that the admission of Pentecostals into discussions of divine action would be to let in, quote, a rather rowdy bunch, end quote. He offers his Pentecostal approach of enchanted naturalism in the hopes of, quote, avoiding such an awkward scene. Now, Smith is, like me, a Canadian. Unlike me, he is from Ontario, from the cultured, enlightened, polite part of Canada. I am from Alberta, the wild west of Canada, where we love an awkward scene and a rowdy bunch. These are some of my fellow Edmontonians. Go Oilers. Now, perhaps those Alberta roots are why I found both Smith and Amos Young's proposals a little too polite, too conceding to the general philosophical timber of the divine action debate today. I just don't think they were sufficiently Pentecostal. And I think one of the Pentecostal gifts to the church is the disruption of familiar norms, with which in turn allows for the inbreaking of the Spirit and a new perspective on God's work in the world. As a short summary, what Smith argues, he argues that a Pentecostal ontology, that is a Pentecostal view of reality, involves a radical openness that rules out naturalistic or metaphysical naturalism. That's the idea that there's nothing but a material reality. Seems straightforward. But it should also rule out dualism or deistic supernaturalisms that are common amongst Pentecostal believers. The idea that there's a spiritual and material world that are totally separate from each other, and God has to sort of break into the material world to act. Instead, Smith vouches for a non-interventionist, inspirited naturalism, which he calls enchanted naturalism. In this sense, the material world is suspended in the Spirit's participatory work, like salt in water. And so the currents of the Spirit's work naturally affect the material world's being. He writes, phenomena described as miraculous are not instances of God breaking into the world as if God were outside it prior to such events. They are instances of a unique and special mode of participation that always already characterizes creation, end quote. I agree. And yet, it is this unique and special mode of participation that needs explaining. Well, I am fully on board with the Spirit's participation everywhere in the world, and Wilson, you brought this up as well. We still need an explanation for when God acts in such a way as to disrupt the normal causal relations of the world. So Amos Young, for his part, articulates the theology of Spirit-filled divine action in what he calls pneumato-eschatological terms, where the Spirit brings the things of God's future to the here and now, but he hesitates to name any particular causal explanation of divine action. He just sort of avoids the science and religion discussion about this all together. He admits that his is a future-oriented account, and as it is first and foremost a theological proposal, its immediate benefit to the science side of the theology and science conversation may not be apparent. So again, he's just admitting, I don't actually get into the weeds of science and religion. In a later work, he describes God as present and at work both from outside, transcendentally, making and shaping the world, and from within, immanently, enabling the created order and its creatures to respond to the divine letting be. And that's about as close as he'll ever get to describing a causal mechanism. Now, process thought is quite close to Jung's account of immanent divine action. And Wilson, this might constitute a fifth way to your list of four, that generally God is thought to be involved in novelty by presenting new possibilities and empowering creatures, and then the creatures enact them. So God, from moment to moment, is creating the possibilities of the future in their multiple different ways, and then creatures enact what happens. A more traditional Pentecostal view sees God as both creating and then enacting possibilities that are entirely beyond the abilities of any creaturely entities to act. So God thinks of a possible future, and rather than just making it a possibility for creatures to choose, God chooses it, makes it happen. So I'm here talking about miracles, and when I talk about miracles or I talk about intervention, this is what I mean, that God acts in a way that reverses, revises, or replaces the usual causal relationships of things in the world with something else that is entirely beyond the normal powers of the creatures existing. Does that all make sense? I realize that's really dense theological language for late in the afternoon after so many good papers. So I'm just going to simply call that miracles at this point. And I want to present three reasons for why I think we should put these causally disruptive interventionist miracles back on the menu of divine action. Well, first, in the theology and religion dialogue, it's often cited that to accept that God could act in ways that are inconsistent with the usual causal relationships of the world, that is sort of the laws of nature, would be to overthrow the reliability of science. This is a particular concern of those who are associated with the Divine Action Project, led by people like Bob Russell. Miracles, it is said, would undermine our confidence in science. I disagree. First of all, the amount of what happens in the world that is actually being scrutinized in any particularly rigorous way by science is minute. God could interrupt the causal relationships in 10,000 ways in this room right now, and neither science nor indeed we might notice. God's interrupting action might overthrow an idealized view of science informed by sort of Karl Popper and the idea that one falsification overthrows everything. But in practice, this is never the case. Talk to a practicing scientist and they will tell you how hard they tried to do the exact same experiment 10 times and ended up with 8 different results, none of which were the results predicted by theory. In the very unlikely event that God's action did disrupt the results of a particular scientific experiment, it would simply be chalked up to an unexplained anomaly, of which there are innumerable examples in day-to-day science. And science as a whole would roll straight on. And this is a point that John Perry and Sarah Lane Ritchie put out in their paper in 2018. So usual methodological naturalism in science, the basics of how we do science, can survive the occurrence of miracles. The presumed conflict lies only between Christian belief and an idealized science, not between Christian belief and real science as it's actually practiced. As a side note, I think the same can be said around the arguments about divine hiddenness. A true miracle could always be explained away by those who wish to explain it away. So the occurrence of a miracle, I don't think, could ever compel belief. And this is where my model differs from sort of Jamie Smith's suggestion of a Pentecostal ontology. He attempts to imagine a model of supernaturalism that doesn't include interruptions or interventions. Will I fully embrace them while also recognizing that there are other ways that God is at work? A second, and perhaps much more important, objection to interventionist divine action or miracles is rooted in the moral obligations of God to creatures. So Philip Clayton and Stephen Knapp have argued that there is a not even once principle. So the idea is if God intervenes supernaturally, even in one case, to avert creaturely suffering, to pull the fawn out of the fire, or to make sure that to destroy a cancer in someone, that God would be morally obliged to do exactly the same action in every other case. So ultimately, God would have to intervene all the time, and this would undermine any sort of natural world order, as well as it would undermine the ability for creatures to learn about their environment, to interact with each other, to form relationships, etc. And I think that this sort of moral argument assumes that all suffering is equal and that God has the same relationship and therefore the same responsibility to each and every creature. And I don't think that that assumption is true. I think that suffering ought to be evaluated not by how severe it is, but by the possibilities of meaning it holds for the sufferer. So in line with process views, if God creates the possibilities of the future, but usually does not unilaterally decide which ones come to pass, then as long as an instance of suffering has a possible path of redemption, I don't think God would be obligated to stop it from happening, even if God could. Since I believe that redemption can happen even after death, the timeline for possible redemption would stretch a rather long time. So, if God acted to stop suffering in one case through a miracle, I see no reason to think that other instances of suffering would fall under the exact same set of needs and therefore call for identical divine action. God works in more than one way. We don't have to fit every act that God does into one category or fit it under one universal theological umbrella. The third objection to miracles comes from process theology, and it's simply that any sort of miracle would imply coercion. If God does a miracle, acts in such a way to enact a possibility apart from the work of creaturely agents, this is seen as forcing them to comply. If God does a miracle by making me swerve to avoid an accident on my bike, I and my body have no choice but to obey. I am made to act, forced to act. and that's seen as incompatible with the love of God and the sort of freedom giving that is essential to divine love. So here I want to lean a little bit on Thomas Aquinas's view, and he says this, that God can do something outside this order created by him when he chooses. For instance, by producing the effects of secondary causes without them, or by producing certain effects to which secondary causes do not extend. It's a bit tricky language, but what it is saying is that normally in the world an effect has a cause. If I pick up my computer is lifted because my hand provides a force. In that example, my hand is the secondary cause. In Aristotle's view, it would be my intention to lift my computer that would be the primary cause, but that's not really important. So what Aquinas is saying is that God can provide the same effect as my hand, the lift on the computer, without my hand being there. The computer is lifted simply by God's choice to create that effect. So there is no coercion because there is no secondary or natural cause causing the effect. If God commandeered the secondary cause, made me move my hand, and forced creatures to do what they had no intention to do, that would be one thing. But to simply cause an effect without the cause at all being involved is simply to add something new to the world, to create ex nihilo, to create out of nothing within the varied causes of the world. God's not coming from outside the world and entering into it. Rather, God, who is present, is newly creating within an already created matrix. Now, another theological problem might be how this works with living, conscious creatures. It is one thing to lift a computer, but what about healing a person? Or if we're talking about Pentecostals, what about speaking in tongues? Well, when it comes to conscious agents, God could act in ways that coordinate with their desires, but bring about things that are beyond their natural abilities, such as healing or spiritual gifts. So by participating with God, they become able to do something that they couldn't do on their own. So in a completely different example, I, for example, cannot keep a steady rhythm on my own. When people, when I'm asked to clap in church, I always have to watch somebody else because I simply can't pick out a rhythm and do it. It's not within my capabilities. But if I'm at a ceilidh and I'm dancing with somebody who really knows how to dance well, I can follow their lead. I can keep a steady rhythm by following my partner who is able to do that. So with God, when we participate with God's will, we can work in and through our cooperation to work miracles that take us beyond our own natural abilities. So I've sort of called my model, Pentecostal meets process, but I've also called it a pluralist model of divine action. And I think it's probably evident why at this point, because I happily draw on Pentecostal process and Thomistic views to articulate the possibilities of miraculous divine action. But I would also add that intervention is not the only way God acts. I see the numerous proposals for divine action, whether interventionist, secondary causes, or the various non-interventionist objective types of divine action, top-down, bottom-up, thought-influencing, creative, sustaining proposals, all as perfectly reasonable, valid ways to understand how God works. The consistency, in my view, does not come from the machine-like predictability of God's actions, but in the perfectly consistent nature of God's love for creation. Now, my view does accept a number of uncomfortable positions. It means that, here's the sad face for the uncomfortable positions. It means that the confusion felt at many Pentecostal prayer meetings, why was this one healed and not that one, remains an unanswered reality, not simply a misunderstanding of the situation. It means that the view held explicitly by my colleague Tom Oord and implicitly by many process theists that there is suffering in the world simply because God cannot stop evil is not the case, if I'm right. Wesley Wildman's argument from neglect raises its ugly head, that a God who could act and does not is guilty of the worst kind of neglect in the world. And these are questions that are not easily solved. I would tentatively advance along the lines of a response like this. A miracle occurred because the particulars of the situation, the way it would influence the possibilities of the future, and the invitation of the persons involved all called in harmony for God's action, and God chose to act. But I actually don't think miracles can be reduced to a formula. That might make God seem inconsistent, and we may not be able to fully categorize God's action philosophically, but I would offer that the only reason for divine action is primarily to lead people towards Christ-likeness. And that's going to happen through all different ways. And that creating the possibilities of a deeper relationship with God are much more important than consistency in the mechanism of divine action or our ability to schematize when and where divine action can occur. There is and always will be an element of surprise to special divine action. And I hope that a sort of pluralist model like what I've described can begin to outline not how it happens, but its character. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bethany. I was so thrilled to discover there's somebody else who can't clap in time.
Someday. In heaven, I will clap on time.
Anyway, thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. We'll have some questions, I'm sure, online and in the audience, but perhaps if I could just kick things off by asking you to comment on another possible way of understanding miracles. Historians of the church will correct me if I'm wrong, but it may have been Augustine who said, nature is what God does, as it were. So there's no real distinction between natural and supernatural in the Hebrew concept of God's action in the world. Everything that happens is what God does. And so I wondered whether, one way of understanding at least some, what we call miracles, are instances where God has acted using laws of nature that we just don't know about yet. I mean, 100 years ago, we thought there was no concept, actually, let's say 150 years ago, the thought of matter passing through other bits of matter was nonsense. Mm-hmm. But now we can create quantum states where matter can pass miraculously through other matter. Mm-hmm. That was a law of nature that wasn't known at that time. Kelvin's remark that heavy and air machines are impossible, because he didn't know about the laws of aerodynamics, he would have thought an airplane was a miracle.
Yeah.
Is that a way of understanding miracles? That is simply God using his existing laws that we just don't know about?
Yeah. So, I mean, if I go back to this slide, I'm going to say, that would be a great example of a non-interventionist objective of divine action. Okay. Right? So that would fit under there. But why say that's all God can do? I really don't. There's this big taboo against saying God can just do whatever God wants without reference to the laws of nature. And that's constantly sort of, and I just don't see any reason to reject it outright in the way that most people in the science-religion dialogue tend to.
Okay. Perhaps we can pick that up later.
Yeah.
Any questions from the audience here? Yes, there's one in the back here. I'll take the mic.
I was glad to see your last slide about the purpose of miracles. Well, I know from taking a home group through John's Gospel that miracles are described as signs as to who Jesus is. And what I'm not sure about is what the other Gospels have to say about that. So I think that's a very important point from sort of scriptural evidence of miracles. Do you have any comments, say, about, say, miracles in the book of Acts or things like that?
Well, Yeah, and I think that's... So again, what I think we can do with miracles is describe their character, but we can't systematize their mechanism. And that tends to be what philosophers and theologians always want to do, right? We want to take electricity and magnetism and make it the electromagnetic force of God's action. You know, we want to say, actually, that you know, like you said, oh, well, that's clearly an example of this sort of, and we want to get down to God works one way. And I know that's not what we see in Scripture. There's no philosophical reason that we should prefer one way of God acting versus all these other ones. And most of the worries that it will overthrow science or whatever, I think, are overblown.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions here? Okay, I think that some of these issues we're going to take up in the panel discussion afterwards, Bethany, if you
Great.
don't mind.
Yeah,
okay.
no, that's fine.
But let's thank Bethany again for a wonderful lecture.